The views and opinions expressed on this program are not necessarily those of this station, JVC Broadcasting Management, or its sponsors.
Welcome to Crime and Justice Radio, where we talk all things crime, justice, mayhem, and the courts with expert insiders and legal outcasts. I'm your host, Aida Leisenring, and I'm here with co-host Bruce Barket. Good evening.
You got a big smile on your face today.
I do. It was a good day, Bruce.
Why was it a good day? Tell us.
It was a good day because this project that started off in 2016 that resulted in the TV show that Vanessa Potkin and I co-executive produced with ABC and Viola Davis focused on an unheard case of a man named Julius Jones who was arrested, locked up, and tried for capital murder in Oklahoma with little to no evidence. He was convicted in 2 days, sentenced to death. And as a result of the show, a lot of people started investigating the matter. It got national attention. And he has an amazing legal team who has been able to get a hearing of commutation for a death row inmate that has never occurred in Oklahoma. And today, I got to watch it live. You got to watch part of it live with me. We heard from the victim's surviving family. We heard from the district attorney. We heard from Julius Jones's attorneys and representatives on his behalf, including Senator George Young. And the parole board, 3-4, they only needed 3 votes, voted to recommend commutation of his sentence. So it's not a done deal, and I certainly don't take it for granted. But if they had rejected his application, then we would no longer be in a position to feel confident about the possibility that he will receive a sentence of life with parole as opposed to being executed at the end of October.
And we've talked about this case quite a bit. We had somebody on a couple of weeks ago who is his best friend in high school. We'll have more people on in the coming weeks. He had an execution date, perhaps still does, for October 28th. So this was a huge step because, as the chairman of the committee said, if we recommend that he not receive any reduction or altering his sentence, the process ends. And it didn't end. They recommended life with parole, so he has a more than a good chance of not being executed, and then his fight for freedom will continue. It's fantastic. It's a great thing. We're going to talk about it some more.
And I'll give you a breakdown of my Jerry Maguire moment in the car as I was listening to their votes.
Look, we talked about this a little bit this morning with Jay Oliver. It was really your impetus, your idea to use Julius as part of the show.
Well, it wasn't my idea to use Julius. We all decided together that he was a perfect fit. You give me too much credit. And I appreciate it, and I will absolutely take the compliment, but this was a baby born of brilliant minds. Vanessa Potkin, Christine Connor, Viola Davis, her husband Julius Tenen, Andrew Wang, ABC, the people at Lincoln Film. There were and amazing directors and producers, Amani Martin and Jeremiah Kroll and Gemma. I mean, we had just a fantastic crew of people behind him, and we had amazing lawyers that were actually attractive enough to film.
It really was a great show, and it's unbelievably great work, and I can't believe that it's turned into what it's turned into, and you really had an impact on this man's life, literally participating and saving it. So good for you. I can't give you enough credit for what you did. It's fantastic. And we were talking about what to label this show tonight. And
well, hold on. It was first because I do these little mock-up, and I usually have the name of the guest, but we have 2 incredible guests. So we wanted to talk about the Texas law, and so I quickly wrote abortion episode. I'm like, God, that sounds terrible. But you recommended life and death, right?
Life and death, because it also touches on Julius Jones.
Right. And it's 2 issues that deal with life and death where We are very politically divided in sort of nonsensical ways. And I don't want to say, that if somebody's conservative, they only believe this. I don't believe we can all check all the same boxes on, opposite sides of the spectrum. But a lot of conservatives are pro-life and don't believe in abortions or believe abortion should be criminalized. And yet they are fervent about the death penalty, and vice versa. So
let me also give a nod to and touch upon the controversial nature that's given nod more than a nod. Saturday was the 20th anniversary of September 11th. Most of the people that are listening remember that. I know that you do. You and I have talked about it. It's been something that our country, and particularly people in New York, think about regularly, and certainly at every point this year. And there's some words. I watched the 60 Minutes piece last night on the New York City firefighters and 9/11. And the thing that struck me was the courage, bravery, honor, sacrifice, selflessness, loss, death, grief, and devastation that all came together when the men and women of the New York City Fire Department ran into burning buildings hoping to save other people. Others being Democrats, Republicans, immigrants, citizens, people from every religion and from dozens of countries. Then I thought about Twitter, the sniping, the pettiness, the vitriol, the insults, the glee in others' demise, and almost no charity or kindness. And I literally stopped and pondered the difference. And, we were so unified then. Leave that aside. We're going to talk about some controversial topics tonight. Abortion, probably one of the most controversial topics in the last 50 years. And I'm just going to ask everyone who's listening and people that are talking about it, and you and me, to remember a few things about the people with whom they disagree. One, the firefighters ran in to save people like the individuals you vehemently disagree with. And although you disagree with them, they can still have a good heart with good motives and be good people. So while we discuss this, let's try to be agreeable while we disagree, if that's possible. And why don't you tell us about the abortion law in Texas, what it's about, and then we'll get to our guests.
In sum and substance, I'll shorthand it. Anyone can sue, regardless of whether they are harmed or whether they have any relationship to the woman that is seeking the abortion. The woman getting the abortion can't be sued. The doctor and anyone else that aids and abets her can be. The suer gets a $10,000 bounty if he succeeds in the lawsuit. Plus, he has all his attorney's fees paid for. The defendant, let's presume it's the doctor provider, doesn't win any attorney fees, even if he wins. Serial suers, serial plaintiffs, can continue to sue as many providers as they want, forever. The rapist can't sue, but someone else can on his behalf, okay? And Roe v. Wade is not a defense to the defendant. So that's probably an oversimplification of it, but for those that didn't really read into the weeds, that's what it is.
It does. It provides a private cause of action for individuals to sue abortion providers and collect money and collect legal fees. And if the abortion provider wins, in other words, if there's a defense verdict, there's not a reverse legal fee obligation. The defendant or the provider can't collect legal fees despite the fact that they win. And you noted that they can be sued by multiple people. So there could be 50 lawsuits against an abortion provider, and the provider can win 49 of them, have to pay lawyers to defend all 49, not collect those legal fees, lose one, have to pay the bounty, and pay the legal fees of the one that prevailed. It's a wild end run around Roe versus Wade, regardless of how you feel about the issue.
And let's talk about our guest, because we have Monsignor James Lisante
coming up in just a minute or so.
Okay. And he's going to weigh in on his views about the pro-life movement and possibly about the Texas abortion law. And we have probably the person in America to discuss the other side of it. That's Lynn Paltrow. She's the founder and executive director of the National Advocates for Pregnant Women. She graduated from NYU School of Law. She's worked on numerous cases challenging restrictions on the right to choose abortion, as well as opposing prosecution and punishment of pregnant women seeking to continue pregnancies to term. She's absolutely amazing and fantastic, and I believe she's doing an amicus brief for the Supreme Court on this very issue. So we'll hear from her later on the show. But I'll say this, and maybe I'll say this later on as well, is there's for me, the most disgusting thing about the law, I don't care if you're pro-life or pro-choice. I don't care if you're pro-Trump or pro-Biden. I don't care if you're pro-vaccine or anti-vaccine, pro-parties of over 10 versus not, what your views on the restaurant industry are. This trend on reporting on fellow citizens is turning into an avalanche of a police state where everyone is encouraged and enlisted to be an informant, not out of the goodness of their hearts, but it's born of, in this case, financial motives or political motives or motives of seeming like the moral person on social media or Twitter, if you will.
I want to touch on that later. I do. I want to come back to that. Monsignor's on the phone now. Let's get him on the line and see what he has to say about this. Monsignor?
Yes, Bruce, Aida, good to be with you.
Good to be with you. Thanks for joining us.
I asked Bruce, even though we know each other, I was like, what do I call him on air? Monsignor, father? Can I call him daddy? Probably not.
Well, the actual terminology, Monsignor, translates as my lord. So, Aida, if you'd like to call me my lord.
I will, my lord.
So let's get right at it. Tell us what you think of the Texas law.
Okay, first of all, I'm happy about the fact that everyone in the country is talking about this. Back in 1988, Bishop Austin Vaughn started getting involved in something called Operation Rescue, which was to demonstrate at abortion clinics and get arrested as a nonviolent way of protesting the 9-month right to abortion. And he said one of the reasons he did it was because in the 1988 election for president, nobody cared or talked about the abortion issue. It was like, okay, that's yesterday. So that we in 2021 are all talking about the laws connected to abortion, I see as a good thing. So Texas and other states have, from my mind, raised something important that people are saying, wait a second, what are our laws and how extreme are they and how limited should they be? So the idea that, again, Texas has reminded people that early in the creation of the unborn person, there's a heartbeat, and that's an indication of humanity is probably a good thing. Now, if we could just move people to understand that there's since 1973, well over 1 million abortions in the richest country in the world. That
1 million abortions a year, not 1 million abortions since 1970.
That's right. 1 million abortions every year is just kind of crazy, and more to the point that people know about Roe versus Wade, but that almost nobody talks about Doe versus Bolton, the follow-up decision that basically said for any reason of health, you can have a 9-month right to abortion, and that health reason, that health concern doesn't have to be physical. It can be emotional stress. It can be I'm depressed. I just don't feel I can carry this child because of that. Lots of reasons, and any reason for the full 9-month right to abortion. Again, most of our people don't know that. And if Texas can highlight people's discussion of the unlimited quality of our laws, it's probably not a bad thing. Now, we can get into, is 6 weeks a good idea? Is it a sellable idea? Well, first of all, before we talk about what's sellable and not sellable politically, let's keep in mind, this isn't a thing we're talking about. This is a person, a preborn person. And I'm fascinated, as a priest who deals with young couples every day of my life, to see them come to me regularly with their 3D pictures of their preborn child, sometimes very, very early in the pregnancy. They have even smaller sonogram pictures. And from the moment they find out they're pregnant, my baby, my baby, my baby, but you talk about an unwanted pregnancy or a mistimed pregnancy, and of course it's just a product of conception or called a fetus. Fascinating, the double standard, the language of illusion we all use instead of facing the reality of what abortion is. So, as you said, Bruce, a moment ago, the fact that there are still over 1 million abortions a year, that we have this crying need in our country from couples who want to adopt but can't adopt, the fact that because so many foreign markets for adoption are closed to us, that more Americans than ever want American babies, means we don't have to abort these million children. We have a home. We have a family. They're never going to be unwanted children. I have in my parish, for instance, families that put themselves on lists regularly for any disabled child that's out there that needs to be adopted. They're not even talking about a healthy child anymore. You have a Down syndrome child, I'll take it. I want to raise this child. I want to have a family. So the whole myth out there of better aborted than an unwanted child, nobody's going to be unwanted if you just let them get born.
Well, let me ask this, okay? Because I respect that viewpoint. I really do. But the issue I take is the government meddling in people's affairs. And I understand the government has to in some instances, right? And Texas is saying, well, we're not criminalizing it. But really, Texas is basically enlisting people to act as state actors and ultimately curb completely all these clinics, all these providers that perform abortion. So my question is this. You want to do drugs, you want to kill yourself, guess what? You get to do it. Will you go to heaven? That's between you and God. If you are, terrified of having a child, didn't mean to get pregnant, no jokes about that, and you, for right or wrong, choose to get an abortion, then isn't the place of the church or of any good citizen to try and counsel the person rather than suing them in court or suing the providers in court? I don't like the meddling the
coercion.
Yeah, the coercion of the state, right? Like there's free will, and we sometimes choose the moral path and sometimes we don't, but that's between us and God.
Again, the whole vigilante quality of this thing is going to be very controversial, and I get that. But I'm still thrilled with the reality that we face some of these important questions. For example, Alan Guttmacher Institute tells us, the think tank of Planned Parenthood, that it's fully 97% of the abortions performed in our country are performed for what they call reasons of social convenience. And I think it's important, whether it's a politician, a person in the street, or a clergyman, to raise that issue with the American conscience and say, can we really justify eliminating a human person because they're socially inconvenient? And fewer than 2% of the cases of abortion have anything to do with the hard cases, rape, incest, danger to the life of the mother. So even if you allow those hard cases, you're still talking about 97% of the abortions that are for social convenience. And I think it's important to challenge the American conscience on that. By the way, I agree with you, Aida, in that I've never counted ever on the reversal of Roe versus Wade. And I still have my questions. Even if you have a court right now that might do that, you have Joe Biden waiting in the wings to give us 2 or 3 more Supreme Court justices to reverse the thing. So I don't think we can count on the courts or the law to do this. I've always believed it's my job, your job, all of our jobs, to be there for people in their moments of crisis pregnancy, but also to challenge people to think, if they are, as you say, saying this isn't the time for me to have a child right now, I think I have to have an abortion, to at least challenge that by offering alternatives and by supporting the notion that they should let the child live. In other words, I'm for changing hearts and minds more than I am for changing laws. So the whole concept of Texas or Mississippi and their attempt to overturn Roe versus Wade or to create new limits on abortion, I wish them well, but I still believe at the end of the day, in our America, after all these years of unrestricted abortion, that it's going to be very hard to get people to give up their abortions. And my fear, of course, is that abortion will still be available for those who are wealthy and not for the poor. And I'd like both poor and rich to make a choice for life instead. That comes with changing hearts and minds. One of the things that would help, and then not doing it at all, you know and I know that popular media, with the exception of this wonderful podcast, are not presenting the pro-life point of view. You can look through, on Long Island we have Newsday or the New York Times, and you will struggle for years to find an op-ed piece, even an op-ed piece, which is supposed to be for multiple opinions, that will provide a perspective on why anyone would be able to call themselves pro-life. It's fascinating to me. And yet, if we could have an honest debate about this and put both sets of facts out there, I think lots more people would honestly make better choices. But that's not out there for us.
Talk to us.
I agree with you on that.
We don't have a ton of time left, but talk to us about the woman, because there's two. Even from your perspective, there's 2 people involved,
right.
A mother and a child.
Definitely.
So
it's not just my perspective. It's not just my perspective. That's the medical reality. I have a bunch of doctors in my.
Some people dispute that.
Yeah, it's yes, and it's got to be. Cardinal John O'Connor long ago said this. Any pro-life perspective that doesn't include support for the mother, especially who's a little stressed about having her pregnancy, is a pro-life message that's empty. So I'm very proud of the fact that I represent the church that has literally put its money where its mouth is to say that anyone of any religion, of any background, of any socioeconomic background who needs help is going to have it. You know, you may or may not know this, but in the Archdiocese of New York, when Cardinal Egan took over from O'Connor, there was great problems with money. There was a bankruptcy facing them, and it wasn't because of scandal. It was because O'Connor had said, if we're going to support people and hope they make the choice for life, then we've got to also give them the means to make a life. So we're not just going to say, hey, woman, don't you have the abortion, but we're going to make sure she has shelter, education, jobs, and everything else she needs to have that child and still support herself. And I think that's the way it's got to go. I would love for Joe Biden and the Democratic majority right now to say, you know, we're going to make it easier for people if they choose not to have their abortion, to have their child by giving them means of support that will be significant. I'm not hearing that. All I'm hearing is more and more money for Planned Parenthood and the ability to further eliminate not just children, preborn children in our country, but then to export abortion to third world countries.
Monsignor,
I know.
Thanks very much. Personally speaking, it was wonderful to hear from you. Talk to you again soon.
Bye, my lord.
Bye now.
Welcome back to Crime and Justice Radio. I'm Aida Leisenring. I'm here with co-host Bruce Barket, and we are discussing the new Texas abortion law. And we have probably one of the most well-informed individuals on this area. She's attorney Lynn Paltrow and the founder and executive director of the National Advocates for Pregnant Women.
Welcome, Lynn. How are you?
Thank you. I'm good. Honored to be here.
Honored to have you.
Excellent. So, same question I asked our guest previously. Tell us what you think of the Texas abortion law.
Well, it's a frightening exhibit of disregard for the Constitution, for our system of law, and especially for the people who sometimes need abortions. I think one of the things I think about a lot at National Advocates for Pregnant Women is the fact that there aren't two kinds of women, the kind of women who have abortions and don't become mothers, and the kind of people who have babies and become mothers. They're all the same women, just at different moments in their lives. So to pass a law that they have so far successfully insulated from any kind of court review, something our constitutional democracy guarantees to all of us, is a law that's overwhelmingly affecting mothers. More than half of women who get abortions are already mothers, if they're in their 20s and 30s. If they're doing it later, 80% are already mothers. And so when we look at laws that, this one in particular, that essentially allows everybody in this country to act as bounty hunters and bring to civil court for a lawsuit with a possible reward of $10,000 anybody who helps someone in Texas access abortion. This is an attack on not just abortion, but on the people who sometimes need them, and they're overwhelmingly mothers.
Now, I don't want to oversimplify the Supreme Court decision in this regard, but essentially they said, well, because there's no state enforcement of it, we're declining to see it. And my question is, all right, so they technically haven't criminalized abortion, but the state is literally using citizens, ordinary citizens, to do their dirty work. So they're in fact state actors when they file the lawsuit.
That's a great argument, and I'm sure it's one that's being made. I think Justice Sotomayor, who wrote a dissent from the court's decision to let this law go into effect, saying, of course we have the power to hear this and address this. It's on its face and unconstitutional ban on abortions. And we could have heard this, but the 5 justices who allowed it to go into effect should be understood as acting in their role as political activists, not as people defending the legitimacy of our Supreme Court and our constitutional democracy.
Aida brought up a point earlier in the show, and I told her I was going to come back to it, and I'm going to come back to it with you now. Her point was that we have the government using private citizens to do things that the government can't do. So we have Texas in this instance saying, look, we can't stop people from having abortions. We can't criminalize it. So we'll give private citizens the power to sue, and hopefully we can sue the providers out of business entirely and ban abortions. And in New York City, the city can't force people to take vaccines. So what they've done is they've enlisted restaurant owners, gyms, other venues to police individuals who want to use those public facilities to see if they have vaccines, and if they don't, they're excluded.
Or college campuses saying if you see a student at a party that's more than 10 people, report them to the school and they're losing their scholarships. And some of these are minority kids that worked really hard to get a 4.0 to get into NYU. But it's this trend of having ordinary citizens report to the government and have that person...
These are really, I think, false comparisons and kind of misleading. But let's just start with the fact that vaccinations have to do with overall public health. And to the extent the government has been, the Supreme Court in the past, in some cases, has said the government can require citizens for the benefit of the general public health to get vaccinated. That isn't a court sitting in a position to decide, one person has to sacrifice for the benefit of another. It's the general public interest, just like why people have to do military service and do other things. The engagement of individuals and companies that you've described do not allow every individual outside of New York State to bring a lawsuit against anybody who doesn't have a vaccine. And if they win that lawsuit, the person who brought the lawsuit gets $10,000, and the person who had to defend themselves can't get attorney's fees, but the person who brought the lawsuit can. It's not a legitimate comparison.
I wasn't, and I didn't mean just to.
I made it.
You made it. I didn't. It's this trend of government enlisting people to report on its citizens. I just don't like it. It's got a bad feel to me.
I agree actually with that. I agree with that wholeheartedly. Let me ask.
There's a difference, but there are important differences between attempts to deal with public health that are different from the surveillance of pregnant women in relationship to their own bodies. But
of course, that the other side is going to say it's not just their bodies. There's 2 bodies. There's 2 people involved, the mother and the unborn child, and the government has an equal interest in protecting the life and welfare of both.
And I'm so glad you brought that up because, I think the thing that gets lost, and even in the discussion about the Texas law and the Supreme Court case that's coming up, it's very much discussed about this is about the right to abortion. But in fact, I think we do as human beings have a hard time figuring out what to do about pregnancy. Everybody listening to this radio broadcast would not be here but for the fact that some woman got pregnant, went to term, and gave birth at significant risk to her own life and health. And that risk for life and health is particularly true for Black women in this country, based on experiences of racism, and stressors, not as a result of anything they do or don't do while they're pregnant. There are not 2 separate people. We can imagine that. We can feel it as an emotional value. The people who get pregnant feel that way, especially as the pregnancy progresses. But as, the La Leche League and other groups point out, there's a point at which you meet your baby. When the baby comes out of your body, at that point, the 14th Amendment says a person exists with rights under the 14th Amendment when they are born. And to insist that the government can balance is the thing that's most frightening to me. One of the first cases I ever worked on was the Angela Carter case. She was 25 weeks pregnant, had survived childhood cancer, was so glad to be alive, so glad to be pregnant, had a recurrence of the cancer around 25 weeks, very quickly became very sick. And she and her doctors and her parents all agreed the right thing to do was to try to keep her alive as long as possible. But based on the claim that the fetus was a separate person, the hospital called an emergency hearing, appointed a lawyer for the fetus, and in the end decided that it had an obligation to save the life of the fetus by cutting Angela Carter open without her consent and over the objections of her Catholic parents. And in so doing, the fetus was so far from viability, it lived for 2 hours and then died. And Angela Carter died 2 days later with a cesarean surgery listed as a contributing factor. This is what the world starts to look like if we take the feeling that the fetus is already separate and apply it as if it actually is a world in which women do not have any right to make decisions about their health care, about what kind of work they do.
It's the slippery slope.
Well, let me ask you this, because you kind of have raised this a couple of times now, saying the government shouldn't be involved in the balancing test. Of course, Roe kind of lays out a escalating right of the unborn and a decreasing right of the woman to make these decisions as the pregnancy progresses. Is your position that all the way through until birth, the mother has the absolute right to decide to terminate the pregnancy?
Well, that's a wonderful question to elicit, really unpleasant thoughts about the people who get pregnant. I don't know anybody who seeks an abortion because they feel like it in their 7th, 8th, or 9th month, although there are some people who face imminent neonatal death and would rather not be forced to continue to be pregnant and have people say, oh, great, what's happening with your baby? But the answer about Roe is that Roe limits one procedure in a context in which I think there's a lot of general societal agreement among everybody that as the pregnancy progresses, it feels more like a separate person, even though it isn't. And so the Supreme Court in Roe set some boundaries about one procedure. But what Roe also did was say that fetuses are not persons at any stage of delivery, at any stage of development, but that pregnant women are persons. And to the extent that the argument that fetuses should be seen as separate or they have separate rights, to the extent that that is applied in contexts outside of limiting one procedure late in pregnancy, and most importantly, they cannot limit it if it's necessary for the woman's life or health, because she is a person. She is a constitutional person, and she may not be required to die or suffer in the name of claimed rights for the fetus. But the world looks very different if you apply any of that principle outside of the abortion context. It looks like the cases that we work on, and many of them involve cases where women have gone to term and given birth to healthy babies and been arrested. The woman in Iowa who fell down a flight of stairs where she was pregnant was arrested for attempted feticide. A woman who was about to be released from jail, as everybody agreed, when they found out that she was HIV positive, they locked her up, kept her there, thinking that somehow incarceration is a great place for somebody who needs health care. A woman who was shot in Alabama, she was shot at 5 months of pregnancy, lost the pregnancy. The person who shot her wasn't charged, but the woman who was shot and lost her pregnancy was charged with manslaughter under the claim that she had put herself in a dangerous position.
It's insane. And most people, I think the general public doesn't realize that. They don't realize how there is a rise in the criminalization of pregnant women, right? And you know this because this is your life's work. This is what you've been doing. But people look at abortion laws, and if they're, uncomfortable with abortions, they say, well, it's a life. They don't realize the slippery slope of what that's going to result in. And you were telling me, and explain how this could be, that if you take away the ability of providers to provide safe abortions for women, that could result in their criminalization in the future. Can you explain how that can happen?
Well, absolutely. I mean, people don't realize that prosecutors have enormous discretion, to file cases, to use whatever law is available to them. And in fact, even with Roe on the books, there have been, since 1973, about 21 cases in which women who had abortions or attempted to have abortions, usually outside of approved medical settings, have been arrested for everything from manslaughter to child endangerment. Many of the abortion laws that have been passed say, don't worry, we're going to ban abortion, but a woman, only the doctor will be punished, the woman won't. Well, it doesn't. It's a joke. It's a hoax. Because prosecutors, we deal with many cases where women have experienced pregnancy losses that they did not want to experience and that they did not cause, although the prosecutor claimed that they did something that caused the pregnancy loss. And they've been charged with murder, depraved heart, homicide, manslaughter. Those laws all exist. They're not abortion laws. They're murder laws. They're child abuse laws. They're delivery of drugs to a minor laws. And prosecutors can just thumb through our criminal code in any state and use the argument that the fetus is separate to use that to police and punish pregnant women. A recent case we're doing right now in Alabama, a pregnant woman with terrible back injuries, who I suspect would never have an abortion in a million years, was pregnant with her sixth very much wanted baby, but she was dealing with severe chronic pain. And during the course of her pregnancy, although she waited as long as she could, she used some prescription pain medicines that had been prescribed to her for precisely that use and only that use. When she gave birth and they tested her baby for drugs in Alabama, a prosecutor there has charged her with possession, unlawful possession of a drug, because he believes that pregnant women should not be able to use even properly prescribed pain medication, because this prosecutor thinks that might be bad for the baby.
Then that's one of the things that your organization does, and I'm somewhat familiar with the work that you do and some of the lawyers that have worked for you, and it really is to advocate in many ways for women, pregnant women, who have been charged criminally for conduct while they were pregnant or just after they were pregnant. And you could tell, I know the cases, you could tell story after story. They're just horrific. We appreciate you coming on and chatting about this. I hope we'll have you back and talk more about the criminal justice issues.
And Bruce said this, but your organization does phenomenal work all across America for vulnerable pregnant women. And it's not all about abortions. It's about women that are criminalized for being pregnant and face these ridiculous, old, draconian laws where they're sometimes locked up for decades for
continuing their pregnancy?
Right. Yes. I know people can't wrap their minds around that, but yes. So we thank you for coming on the show.
We appreciate it. Hopefully we'll have you back. Thanks, Lynn. Great conversation. Good insights.
All right. Take care.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Really fascinating. We could go back.
I'd like to have her and Monsignor together because I think they'd actually agree about a lot.
Maybe we could have the Monsignor in the studio and have Lynn call in, or vice versa.
Yeah.
Or both of them in the studio. It'd be an interesting discussion, and I bet we'd find some middle ground. But as we wrap up this show, I want to come back to, and it's hard to do, but let's come back to Julius Jones.
I want to end on the hope for life for Julius in our life and death episode, right?
But we talked about the recommendation from the board today was that he receive life
and understand
with the possibility of parole.
Right, but let me explain this, okay? First of all, that board is accustomed to hearing people that have life with parole come before them. They're not accustomed during that specific hearing to hear a clemency petition from someone on death row. And normally when they hear from inmates, they're saying, sorry, I did this, I regret it, have mercy on me, I've been a good inmate for 20 years or however many years. That's not what we had here today. It was a claim based on actual innocence. And all 3 of the 4 parole members said, I have doubts. I respect the family members of the victim. I am so sorry that they went through what they did. I appreciate their courage coming here and speaking today. I respect hearing from the prosecutor. But I have doubts about this case, and therefore, because no other courts can actually free him at this point, he's gone through his appeals, we are here to, in times, do that which other courts can't do and give mercy. So that's what they've recommended. Governor Stitt has to make a ruling, has to make a decision on that, right? But the board recommended to Governor Stitt, which, by the way, he's got support for this. 60% of Oklahomans believe Julius Jones his sentence should be commuted. Ultimately will make the final decision. Watching that live was unbelievable. I mean,
it was like watching. It was like being at a verdict. It was
like watching closing arguments from all sides,
and then a verdict right away. It was TV. What they do on TV, which you have the whole trial, and everything takes place in an hour, and then there's a verdict at the end. They literally did that for real with a life and death issue here. It was unreal. Tell us, what was it like? Because you knew him, you spoke to him, you know his family, you know his sisters, you know his lawyers.
I just drank the Kool-Aid. I prayed, and I wouldn't lose hope. And the right thing happened here. I believe it. And I just want to say for the family members of the victims, my dad watched this and he goes, wow, they're very compelling. And I said, of course they are. And they ought to be, because they actually really lost a loved one. The daughter of the victim who testified today was 9 years old and actually experienced the murder of her father
in the car,
right? So
she
gets a voice, but that doesn't mean they got the right man, and I don't think they did.
Back next week.
The views and opinions expressed on this program are not necessarily those of this station, JVC Broadcasting Management, or its sponsors.